Why aren't other forms of history taught in school? Like, let me give you a rundown of what I'm trying to say. 6th grade, I don't know if this is the same in other schools. Maybe it's just here in rural America, maybe it's just in my small town. Maybe that's the case. I don't know. But let me tell you this. 6th grade, world history. 7th grade, world history. 8th grade, let me think. I had West Virginia history. Okay, so I had state history, which is okay. I don't mind that. 9th grade, world history again. Let me see. 10th grade, United States Part 1 history, which is from its beginning. So we had all the way, we taught all the way from when Columbus came to the New World up until it ended with the Civil War. So we had that part. United States 2. We didn't call it United States History 2. We call it Contemporary Studies, which I feel like that's just completely dumb because it was not anything contemporary about it. But it's taught from Reconstruction to the 60s. And we don't even talk about everything in the 60s, but I'll get to that in a minute. And then that was 11th grade, if I'm right, yes. 10th grade U.S. History, 11th grade part Contemporary Studies, like I said, or U.S. History Part 2. And then 12th grade, we had United States Civics. Okay, why the 3 times I need to learn about world history? And this is something I actually talked to with my cooperating teacher, I guess my mentor, when I was studying to be an educator. I said that I would like to see, instead this happened, I would like students in the 6th and 7th grade. In 6th grade, you have a world history part 1, which is going to teach you about the normal, kind of the run-of-the-mill, usual things, ancient Greece, ancient Rome, ancient China, those things. U.S. History Part 2, this was something that needs to be discussed more. We need to learn about Mesoamerica more. We need to learn about Africa more. We need to learn about Polynesians more. We need to learn about natives here in North America, here in the United States, Canada, North America, that sense. We never talk, like, when I was in those 3 world history class, we talked about the Aztecs, the Mayan, the Inca, and that was it. There are other freaking, I'm sorry, I know that's not a bad word, but like, it makes me so angry, it makes me so concerned, like, it's like, it doesn't make any sense to me how, when it comes to the New World, like, when we talk about the western part of the world, the Western Hemisphere, that's all we talk about. The Aztecs, the Mayans, the Olmecs, and the Incas. There was more than just those people living over here, There are other people that did many great things, and we never talk about Africa. Like, we talk about ancient Egypt. Yeah, I understand that's a country. Yeah, that's a country in Africa. We talk about Egypt. What about the rest of northern Africa? What about the tribes that live throughout Africa? What about southern Africa? The southern part of Africa, when we were literally, before people started learning that they could go through the Mediterranean part, like all that, they were going through that. They were going all around Africa. I know. No, I understand, like, through colonization, history was lost. Like, I completely get that. Like, history was destroyed. There weren't many oral traditions. But come on now. We have come so far as historians, social scientists, whatever you want to say. We know we have a little bit more history in us than we did back then, if that makes sense. So, like I said, United States history, yeah, we can learn about ancient Rome, ancient Greece, ancient Japan. All the world history part 1, 6th grade, Eastern Hemisphere. The Eastern Hemisphere. We can leave it to the regular things that we always talk about. World history part 2, that needs to include Africa, Polynesians, and all of the Americas. Because I'm getting sick of them getting left out of the discussion, because they had a lot of great things going on for them too. So there's that. Next, 8th grade. I think that they should learn about 8th grade history should be the state history. I think that's where we should start learning about this, because I feel like, to be honest, I feel that United States history needs to be left to older children, if that makes sense. So with 9th grade, 10th grade, I feel like that's when they should be learning about, and here's this, so let me keep going on, hold on, before I get into what I'm going to say. But 9th grade, U.S. History Part 1, so from when, like, they discovered the New World, you know, they discovered the New World, or Columbus he discovered Hispaniola, or whatever you want to say. So from that part up until the Civil War, I get that. United States History, 10th grade, Part 2, from Reconstruction up into the 60s. United States Part 3, we need from the 70s up until now, because that is contemporary studies. It at least needs to include the 70s, the 80s, the 90s, and the early 2000s. And I'll get to that in a minute. 12th grade, U.S. History, Civics. That makes sense. Okay, that makes sense. U.S. History, Civics. So we have it all right there. Let me go through it again. 6th grade, World History Part 1. 7th grade, World History Part 2. 8th grade, State History. 10th grade, U.S. History Part 1. 9th grade, U.S. History Part 1. 10th grade, U.S. History Part 2. 11th grade, U.S. History Part 3. And then the final grade, 12th grade, Civics. Alright, now let me explain this. Like I said earlier, I really don't feel that 6th graders, 7th graders, at least when I was teaching at the school that I taught at, because like I said earlier, when I was in 6th grade, 7th grade, I learned about world history. But the school that I taught at, they were teaching children, you know, United States history, both those parts in 6th and 7th grade. And I feel like with some of the topics that we have to dabble with, you know, that kind of require higher critical thinking skills, I just do not feel like their literacy comprehension is at that level yet, nor are they really equipped to be dealing with that high level sensitive material, if that makes sense. Like, I get that there are some children who have experienced a lot in life. I'm not trying to say that. There are some children who experience a lot in their life. There are some children who experience some of the things we do talk about in history. That's not what I'm saying. I think that to some degree, it takes a much more higher level sense to be trying to dabble with things like the Great Migration, to understand the cultural importance of the Harlem Renaissance, to understand that while we were fighting in World War II, we were also facing many injustices here in the United States as well on the home front, to try to compare how FDR was uniting the country, how FDR was uniting the country with positive reinforcement compared to Hitler using negative reinforcement during that time period. Let's see what else. Trying to talk about economics during for the Great Depression. Like, some kids get it, and then some kids, they don't get it. Let's see what else. The Civil War, just to simplify it down to that, it was just around an idea of just slavery. It wasn't just about slavery. And that is something too that has been long over generalized, that the Civil War just broke out because of slavery. Yes, it was one of the things, but in reality, the South broke away from the North because of how different their values were, if that makes sense. But yeah, like I said, I just feel that when we start grappling with things here in the United States, I just feel like children first should learn more about other cultures around them. And I feel like when you start with 6th and 7th graders learning about world history, and you begin on that lower level of critical thinking, like saying, okay, how are the Aztecs and the Mayans different, and what were their cultural, how did they contribute to the world culturally or socially or through their technology, something like that. Because if you know, the Aztecs had those floating gardens, which is pretty phenomenal when you go and look at it. Like, I'm surprised that we don't have children trying to recreate something in that manner. I think it would help with world history for them trying to go about maybe creating their own governments or creating their own societies or creating their own type of technology to see if they can maybe create something better or something similar to those ancient ancestors. I think that's something that needs to take place first. Like I said, to help with the involvement of critical thinking, teaching them how to read certain resources. I think it would be much more interesting to them learning about those things first, and then, like I said, getting into their state's history, which I feel like would begin leading into the United States history, And then, like I said, I think that when you get to the 9th grade, the 10th grade, the 11th grade level, I feel like they're ready to get into that higher level of critical thinking. They're ready to debate, because it's hard to, when you have 6th and 7th graders trying to debate these they're not really hot topics, but like something like Tinker versus Des Moines, like they're not really understanding an armband. They just don't get that. Or like one time when I was talking about the Zoot Suit riot, and I was trying to teach them about how, I was trying to tell them about how I started off with a warm-up. Maybe this is what I did wrong. But I said, let's say, I say some of you guys wear the same, maybe the same coat every day or the same pair of shoes. Maybe you enjoy it, maybe because you have to do it. But let's say you enjoy it, I said some of you, I say every day I come in and I wear the same jacket because I like it. I said, let's say somebody came in and they told you that you could no longer wear that coat or those pair of shoes that you enjoy wearing so much. How would that make you feel? And they say, well, it made me kind of feel a little angry. They said, it made me feel sad. I'd be asking why. They said, I don't understand though why I would have to do it. And then I went to talk about the Zoot Suit riot, but they didn't really understand. They just didn't get like how, they just didn't understand how clothing to that sense was about identity, and how the Navy men doing those horrendous or horrible acts, like stripping them literally bare of their zoot suit for many Mexican Americans, was even how the Navy men saw those individuals unpatriotic. Like they did not get it. And it's not that they couldn't get it, it was just that I don't think that they had time to get to that level of higher critical thinking. And maybe, like I said, maybe it was on my end too. Maybe I wasn't helping them understand that much. But they got that first part with the warm-up, but they just couldn't relate it. They couldn't get the relation to it. So I feel like, to that sense, some of these ideas that are in the United States history, when it comes to that part of history, the United States history, need to be dealt with older grades. But why I feel like we need a United States Part 3 history that includes the 70s, the 80s, and 90s. And this was something I talked about with, like I said, with my cooperating teacher when I was studying to be an educator. It makes no sense to me. And this is something that, when you look at history, you come to understand that each decade makes the next decade. That decades borrow from other decades, okay? It makes no sense to me how we live in a digital world and we do not talk about the internet in the 90s. It makes no sense to me how hip-hop in itself is a global phenomenon. It is the top-notch global phenomenon, similar to jazz, but yet we do not talk about the birth of hip-hop or rap music. We do not talk about the birth of hip-hop in the 70s, nor how it became to be what it is in the 90s. Like, can somebody explain this to me? We do not talk about Reaganomics, the growth of the Republican Party, or these big MAGA pastors in the 80s. Like, that's where it started at. How do we not talk about, we understand in this country the opioid crisis is serious. How do we not start talking about opioids, the opioid crisis, which to some degree began in the 90s? And not only that, how do we not talk about opium in general, when before we had the opiate crisis, we had things like heroin, which was always being used by big celebrities like Billie Holiday, Ray Charles, Kurt Cobain of Nirvana. How are we not talking about these issues that have always been relevant to our society? How are we not teaching children about the HIV/AIDS epidemic in school? What that happened in the 80s and 90s. And I remember one time when I was in world history class, 9th grade, we were talking about the bubonic plague. And I don't exactly remember how he asked us. We were talking about the bubonic plague, but I don't know exactly how he worded the question for me to answer HIV/AIDS. But the other kids around me looked like they didn't understand what that was. I don't know. And I have people in my family who have AIDS. I had a grandmother who died who died of AIDS-related complications, which it's a sad story, I guess, but it is what it is. She got AIDS for reasons that were not moral, but that's not what we're talking about. But for kids to not know about, like, let's say this, during COVID, we talked so much about the Spanish flu. We talked about the Spanish flu, and I'm not saying COVID is like HIV/AIDS, but why are we trying to compare things that are so far away from us when we literally have things that are literally only 40, 50 years? I don't know. They're not even that far back. Like, I think people would relate it to some more of a sense to that than trying to compare it to the Spanish flu or something. I don't know. Maybe that's a bad example. But to not talk about HIV/AIDS, an epidemic within our country, it's crazy to me. To not talk about all the people who were uneducated at a time. My grandfather worked in a hospital during that time period. And he said that he came to a point where he was going to quit because he was so scared because the doctors did not know how it spread. That's how scared he was. And we're not teaching kids about that. And I'm sure there's kids who have people in their family with AIDS, who have AIDS or HIV or who are taking some type of medication. I'm sure of it. Because if I'm only 24 years old and I have people in my family with that autoimmune disease, I think that's what it is, if I'm correct, then I'm sure there are other children who have people in their family like that. It doesn't make any sense to me how we're not talking about those things. It doesn't make any sense to me how we don't talk about the 1970s recession or the 2008 recession. But we talk about the Great Depression in the 1920s. Makes no sense to me. Makes no sense. And not only that, when we get to the 60s, this is what makes me mad. We talk about Vietnam War, but we really don't talk about Vietnam War like we should. We don't talk about the really horrendous atrocities that were going on in that war. We just talk about the Vietnam War to talk about the proxy war, the war between capitalism and communism. You know what I mean, communists. And that's what irritates me too. Not only that, when we talk about the 60s, we talk about the civil rights movement, but we just talk about black people. We don't talk about the 1968 walkouts in Los Angeles. We don't talk about the renewal of the Mexican identity from the Pachuco to the Chicano of the 60s. We don't talk about those things. We don't talk about civil rights for women. We don't even talk about civil rights for the Native Americans. And they were trying to get civil rights too during that time period. And only when we talk about civil rights, when it comes to the 60s, it's always about black people. And I'm not trying to say there's anything wrong with that. But I'm just saying, why aren't we expanding past the 60s? And why aren't we going more in depth when it comes to the 60s? Like, the 60s up into the 90s should be how the 21st century was created. Especially when it comes to the 80s and 90s. You're not going to try to tell me that the 80s and 90s did not create, to a degree, the 21st century. And you're telling me you're not going to teach kids about that? That's just so wild to me. It really is wild to me. Like, it gets me so heated. I mean, I could go on all day about how the 90s created the 21st century, and yet students don't even know nothing about the 90s. Their parents are sitting right there, and yet we're not even teaching them about their parents' history. We're not teaching them about tabloid TV that created reality TV of today. Things like Jerry Springer. Like I said, we're not teaching them about the internet and the beginning of, in some sense, of the cell phone. We're not teaching them about those things. We don't even talk about the Gulf War. How do we not talk about the Gulf War? Like, we don't talk about the Gulf War, and then we don't even talk about terrorism of the Taliban the way we're supposed to talk about them. To some degree, like I said back then, you know how we don't talk about Vietnam the way we're supposed to? If we don't even talk about the Russo-Afghan War, and when we were in Afghanistan fighting the Russians, trying to push the Russians out, we actually, I'm not saying at the time we were not expecting them to become terrorists, but we don't talk about that. We actually trained some of those people, and they went out to create these groups later on, because we stayed in Afghanistan after we put the Russians out, and we started building there. And during that time, not only that, a lot of theologian schools began teaching them. Like, some of the things that are happening in the United States, we're just not teaching. And I feel like if we taught them, children would begin to wrap their head around some of these issues and say, oh, I get it now. I get it where it all started at. We have to start teaching about the 70s, the 80s, and the 90s. We have to start teaching about these things. Like I said, it's so confusing to me how we don't teach about the Gulf War. Like, we're not going to teach about the Gulf War. We're not going to teach that we were in Afghanistan for 20 years. Are you crazy? We're not teaching them that. And I told my mom this. You know what she told me? She said, well, it's not history yet. What do you mean it's not history yet? What do you mean it's not history yet? You're standing right here in front of me, aren't you? Aren't you? like she's 40 years old. My mom's very young. She had me when she was in high school. She had me when she was 16. Though I was born in 2000. She was born in 84. But like, she's 40 years old. You're telling me, how long does it take for something to become history? It's been 40 years. I think, my stepdad was born in 75. Like, it's been 50 years almost since 75. Like, I think it's time we start talking about some of these things here, don't you think? I think it's time we talk about the 70s, the 80s, and the 90s in school. I think it's very important. Yeah. I think it's important to talk about the 40s and 50s to help create modern day societies where we start getting some of our highways from. But if we're not talking about the 90s, how are some of these kids going to understand the basic, how their society formed? The 40s and 50s and 60s helped form the 70s, 80s, and the 90s. But our 70s, 80s, and 90s is forming the 21st century today. And I think that it's important that we start learning about it. I'm sorry to go on a big rant, but like I said, it just kind of irritates me. It does irritate me how, like, we just stop at the 60s. Like, it's been 40, 50 years, like I've told you, since the 70s and 80s. It's been 30-something years. I don't know. Let me see. Almost, if you were born in 94, yeah, I guess you'd be 30. So, yeah. So, I think we need to start talking about some things. All right. But that's all I have to say. If I got some things wrong during my rant, or I overgeneralize something, I'm sorry. Because sometimes my brain be like that when I get a little passionate about history and what I think should be done. And like I said too, maybe all schools are different. But where I grew up at, and then in the surrounding schools around me, something ain't right here. Maybe this is a debate I need to be taking up with them, an issue I need to take up with them. And not only that, we need to have some more electives up in the history, because just those basic history classes, like I said, you can't teach everything. But can you give us some electives, Can we give a little bit more in depth about the Civil War, maybe? Maybe we can give a little bit more in-depth class about Native Americans here in the United States, Anything. Maybe the identity of how, like I said, the Mexican American went to the Pachuca, went to the Chicano, and how many of them are, let me tell you something else. We don't even talk about how Chicanoism spread to Japan. Like, that's some serious stuff right there. Like, can we get some other classes? Somebody, maybe the historian, the social scientist, somebody need to start creating the history curriculum for schools. Because we're going to need a little bit more. We're going to need a little bit more. I'm sorry.